Hey everyone! Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most unexpectedly mind-bending chapters of ancient history, the world of Egyptian recreational chemistry. Yep, the same civilization that gave us pyramids, mummies, and the afterlife also knew how to throw a party that would make your college roommate's wildest night look tame. Before we dive in, take a quick second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of deep dive into the strange and fascinating corners of history. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing how this little community spans the entire globe. All right, lights low, vibes calm, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, because we're about to slip into a story that's both mystical and, well, a little intoxicating. Let's start with one of ancient Egypt's most famous and infamous botanical secrets, the blue lotus flower. You've probably seen it in tomb paintings. Elegant blue petals graced by pharaohs, gently sniffed during banquets, almost like the ancient version of raising a glass for a toast. But here's the twist. This flower wasn't just a pretty decoration. The Egyptians believed it held divine powers and mild psychoactive effects. That's right. The blue lotus could get you feeling pleasantly floaty. The recipe was simple: dry the petals, soak them in wine for a few days, and then drink. People used it during festivals, ceremonies, or, honestly, whenever they needed to tune out the sound of a few hundred people chanting hymns at full volume. Brewed the result? A calm, dreamy euphoria. Not enough to make you forget who you were, but definitely enough to make pyramid building sound like a fun team project. Now, to be fair, the Egyptians never thought of it as getting high. To them, it was a sacred connection with the gods. The blue lotus symbolized rebirth and was closely tied to the sun god Ra, which made it a centerpiece in temple ritu. ALS and burial rites. Holding it to one's nose symbolized breathing in divinity, though it probably doubled as a relaxing way to unwind after a long day of ruling the Nile. You see it everywhere in their art. Pharaohs holding it, party guests passing it around like a floral peace pipe, and even mummies wrapped with it for their journey to the afterlife. The logic seemed simple. If we're heading to eternity, we might as well bring the good stuff along. But the blue lotus wasn't just reserved for sacred ceremonies. It also spiced up the wild side of Egyptian life. At festivals, lotus-infused wine flowed freely, making the music louder, the dancing looser, and the hieroglyphic poetry just a little more profound. Picture this: a crowd gathered under a velvet sky, stars twinkling above the desert sands, everyone sipping lotus wine and swaying with the rhythm of drums and flutes. For the Egyptians, that was more than fun. It was spiritual bliss wrapped in celebration. And speaking of celebrations, let's talk about one of the wildest parties in ancient history, the Feast of Drunkenness. Yes, that was its actual name. Subtle? Not really. Honest? Absolutely. This annual event was held in honor of the goddess Hathor, the divine embodiment of love, music, and, apparently, extreme hangovers. According to myth, Hathor was once sent to punish humanity after they'd seriously angered the gods. Her rampage got so bloody that the other gods had to step in, deciding maybe humanity had learned its lesson. So, how did they stop her? They filled thousands of jars with beer dyed red to look like blood. Hathor drank it, passed out, and when she woke up, the apocalypse was canceled, humanity was spared, and a celestial hangover became a cause for celebration. Every year after that, Egyptians gathered to drink themselves into a divine trance in her honor. And no, this wasn't metaphorical. The goal was literal obliteration. The festival began at dawn with drumming, singing, and priests urging everyone to drink as your heart desires, which, in that context, wasn't a blessing, it was a challenge. Revelers banged tambourines, danced in the streets, and claimed to see the goddess herself, though whether that was Hathor or just the side of a clay jug was probably debatable. Still, beneath the chaos, there was deep meaning. It wasn't just about losing control, it was about finding balance between destruction and joy. A reminder that even wrathful gods could be calmed, with enough rhythm, reverence, and red beer. So, in a way, It was theology meets a keg stand, proof that ancient Egypt knew how to blend spirituality and celebration better than anyone else in history. Ibrahim, and the best part, all of this was officially approved behavior. No shame, no gossip, no awkward, what happened last night chats the next morning in the sacred grove. Getting drunk wasn't frowned upon. It was practically a spiritual duty. In fact, not passing out might have raised eyebrows. Why aren't you spiritually elevated, Kumhotep? Do you not love the gods? Modern scholars describe the Feast of Drunkenness as a ritual of renewal, a chance to purge your fears, your inhibitions, and probably your stomach contents, all in one divine, socially acceptable binge. By sunrise, there'd be pounding headaches, a few regrets, maybe a new scar shaped like Anubis, but also, supposedly, a sense of spiritual cleansing. Now, before you imagine golden chalices and crisp lagers, let's set the record straight. Egyptian beer was nothing like what you'd order at a bar today. Forget golden fizz and foam, this was thick, grainy, and alarmingly opaque. Imagine drinking a bowl of half-blended oatmeal that decided to get tipsy. Beer for the Egyptians wasn't just a beverage, it was a food group, made from half-baked loaves of emmer bread soaked in water, mashed, and left to ferment into a lumpy slurry. Some called it liquid bread. Others probably just called it lunch. Ibrahim, everyone rank it. Peasants, priests, scribes, even kids. Because when the sun's beating down, the Nile's full of mystery microbes, and you've got a pyramid to build, this carb-loaded brew was life itself. It was safe, it was filling, and it gave just enough buzz to make hauling limestone seem slightly less miserable. And here's where it gets interesting. Egyptians didn't just stop at plain beer. They customized it. Herbs, spices, fruits, even wild additives found their way into the mix during festivals and temple ceremonies. Want to commune with the gods? Toss in some mandrake. Want to forget the priest's 3-hour lecture on cosmic order? A splash of fermented date juice might do the trick. Beer was safer than water, tastier than desperation, and more dependable than most coworkers. Its strength varied, from a gentle buzz to, I forgot how sandals work. Workers on royal construction sites were even paid in beer, often several liters a day. So yes, half of ancient Egypt was literally built on bread and booze. Brr. Imagine your paycheck coming in liquid carbs. Not bad, right? But let's not romanticize it too much. Egyptian beer wasn't exactly delicious. It had the consistency of pudding, looked like beige soup, and came with free chewable chunks of bread. Archaeologists politely call it rustic. Modern brewers might call it a crime. Still, it kept an empire hydrated, nourished, and just tipsy enough to endure desert life. Served from communal jugs, it wasn't unusual to see 5 adults sipping through straws from the same clay pot. Forget bar tabs, this was unity through soggy bread water. And just when you think it couldn't get any more sensory, enter kaifi, the incense of the gods. Kaifi wasn't your average stick of incense. It was a complex, intoxicating blend of honey, myrrh, raisins, wine, cinnamon, juniper, mint, basically whatever smelled good and wasn't nailed to the temple wall. Think of it as spiritual perfume meets ancient bakery. Ibrahim priests mixed it, fermented it, rolled it into pellets, and then burned it slowly in temples until the air was thick with sweet, smoky devotion. No ventilation, of course. That would disturb the sanctity. So picture a limestone chamber, a sweating priest waving a burning dish, and a crowd of worshippers inhaling what's either divine presence or mild carbon monoxide. Kaifi served as incense, medicine, and perfume all at once. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder even claimed it cured snake bites and improved sleep, which is plausible if sleep meant passing out cold. Its recipes were legendary, sometimes requiring 16 ingredients added in phases under specific moon cycles. A single batch could take weeks, but once lit, the aroma drifted across the Nile like a sacred fog machine, signaling divine ritual or just someone overcompensating for yesterday's fish market. Kaifi was so integral that it followed Egyptians even into death. It was burned during mummification and sealed inside tombs, a final aromatic send-off that might have made at least one pharaoh smell like a honey-glazed pastry. Now, if Blue Lotus was Egypt's chill, mystical friend and Kaifi was the dramatic one with a flair for theatrics, then Mandrake was the unhinged guest no one should have invited. Mandrake, or Mandragora, was the plant of legends. With its forked roots that looked eerily like tiny human figures, it was equal parts medicine and nightmare fuel. Used in Egyptian medicine as a painkiller and aphrodisiac, it held the kind of power that even seasoned priests handled with care and maybe a backup plan. Ancient texts, like the Ebers papyrus, list Mandrake for insomnia, fertility, and heart health. Noble intentions, except for one small detail: the difference between healing and hallucinating was a few milligrams. Mandrake contains potent alkaloids, scopolamine and atropine, chemicals that can relax your nerves or convince you your bed is melting. In small doses, it was soothing. In larger ones, welcome to your personal fever dream starring the sun god Ra and a crocodile in a wig. Folklore even warned that pulling a mandrake root from the earth caused it to scream, loudly enough to kill whoever heard it. The solution? Tie the root to a dog, plug your ears, and let the poor animal do the dirty work. There's no proof Egyptians actually did this, but it fits perfectly with their mix of reverence and chaos. Mandrake wasn't for everyone. It was reserved for priests, magicians, and the truly daring, the kind of people who thought a mild hallucination counted as spiritual growth. Used wisely, it healed and inspired. Used recklessly, it turned you into someone who thought they were a scarab beetle. And Mandrake wasn't alone in Egypt's ancient apothecary. Tucked deep in those medical scrolls is a little mention of something far more familiar: Shemsmet, better known as cannabis. Yep, the Egyptians were early explorers of that too. Found in texts like the Ebers and Ramesseum. Papyri, cannabis was used to treat inflammation, sore eyes, and, surprisingly, women's health issues. Some remedies even mention THC-infused suppositories, which sounds like the kind of holistic trend that would absolutely resurface on Etsy. They didn't smoke it or bake brownies, at least not that we know of. Instead, they crushed it into oils, salves, and honey blends. Applied topically, it eased pain. Inhaled accidentally? Well, suddenly the temple incense starts to make more sense. Hebrew, was it for fun? Officially, no. Unofficially, let's just say when you're ruling a desert empire in 120-deg heat with crocodiles in your irrigation system, a little herbal calm sounds divine. Residue from mummies and burial jars has even revealed traces of cannabis, opium, and nicotine, making Egypt's funerary offerings look suspiciously like an ancient care package. And speaking of opium, that's where things get both fascinating and hazy. Imported through trade from the Mediterranean, poppy pods, it became one of the ancient world's most prized sedatives. By the New Kingdom, opium was a medical miracle, relieving pain, calming coughs, easing childbirth, and occasionally turning temple chants into divine lullabies. Priests used it in potions, drinks, and even suppositories, because apparently that was their favorite delivery method. In moderation, it soothed suffering. In excess, it turned temple assistants into dazed background dancers. But in a world of plague, toothaches, and sandstorms, opium was a small slice of mercy, a way to silence pain, even if it blurred the edges of reality. And of course, all of this, from lotus to beer, from incense to opium, found its ultimate expression in the drink of the gods, wine. In ancient Egypt, wine was sacred, a symbol of status, ritual, and divine connection. But don't be fooled by the elegant amphory. These wines could hit hard. Egyptians loved to infuse them with blue lotus, mandrake, myrrh, or frankincense, ingredients that sounded holy but acted like ancient mood enhancers. At festivals like the Feast of Drunkenness, no one was sipping to savor flavor. They were chugging to reach transcendence. The goal wasn't to be tipsy, it was to teeter between worlds, possibly while dancing with a priest in leopard skin. Some of these sacred wines were even listed in medical texts as remedies. Got a headache? Try wine steeped with fermented lotus petals. Aching joints? Red wine infused with frankincense. Existential dread? That one required priestly supervision. and maybe a soft place to fall. Even the gods, it seems, enjoyed a good offering. Temples overflowed with vats of spiked wine, poured out to invite divine presence, or at least a slightly swaying statue. Because in Egypt, if the room started spinning, it wasn't intoxication, it was enlightenment. For them, wine wasn't just a drink, it was a doorway. Ever thought of ancient Egypt as the land of pyramids, pharaohs, and perfect order? Well, it turns their spiritual life was a little more psychedelic than you'd expect. For the Egyptians, the blue lotus wasn't just a pretty flower floating on the Nile, it was a key, a vehicle that could take you anywhere, enlightenment, deep sleep, or straight into the arms of a very confused crocodile god. This was a civilization obsessed with geometry, ritual, and divine order, yet they were surprisingly open to losing control of their minds. Trance states weren't taboo, they were celebrated, just preferably not during the tax audits. To the Egyptians, altered states weren't a problem to fix, they were the hotline to the gods. When someone started shaking or chanting mid-ritual, it wasn't a crisis. It was a promotion. A dancer trembling mid-routine wasn't escorted out, she was honored. Hathor, goddess of music and pleasure, had apparently arrived and had strong opinions about tambourine tempo. These divine encounters weren't accidental. They were carefully cultivated through the art of sensory overload, endless drumming, hypnotic chanting, clouds of incense smoke, sleepless nights and wine that sometimes contained mysterious extras. The result? Prophecies, gasps, collapses, and sometimes an unscheduled nap on the temple floor. Priests and priestesses trained for years to become divine hosts, human vessels for gods. Voices would change, postures would shift, and cryptic proclamations would echo through the halls. What looked to outsiders like chaos was, in fact, Egypt's most sacred form of communication. The gods didn't just whisper advice, sometimes they scolded, and occasionally they demanded more cake offerings, proving even deities had sweet teeth. Of course, not every possession was invited. Some chosen individuals were suddenly overtaken, shaking, shouting, and surrounded by enough incense to fumigate a small village. Whether that was genuine divinity or the result of breathing kefi smoke for 4 straight hours remains a mystery. When it was over, the medium would wake up drenched in sweat and confusion. The ceremony ended with applause, a sacred sip of wine, and maybe a nap behind a pillar. To us, it might look like performance art meets heat stroke. To them, it was the moment heaven and earth briefly touched. The dead don't miss a party, you'd think dying would excuse you from social events. Not in Egypt. The border between the living and the dead was more of a polite suggestion, like don't swim after eating. The Egyptians didn't just respect their ancestors, they included them. During festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, families would pack baskets of food, jugs of beer, and head to the tombs like ancient tailgaters. They'd sit by the tomb, share a meal, drink, sing, and chat with their late relatives, often literally speaking to carved false doors where spirits could supposedly receive the offerings. Maybe the dead couldn't eat, but they could at least enjoy the smell. To them, this wasn't spooky. It was natural. The dead still enjoyed music, food, and gossip, so why not throw them a party? And just like any family reunion, things got emotional. People cried, confessed secrets, or accidentally sat on sacred bread. The dead were believed to bless their living relatives in return, with good crops, peaceful dreams, and fewer run-ins with hippos. Sometimes visitors even spent the night in the tombs, hoping their ancestors would drop by in their dreams with advice like, "Stop lending money to your brother," or "The amulets go on the left." It might sound eerie now, but for the Egyptians, wasn't the end. It was just a change of address. The morning after the divine Ibrahim, of course, all this sacred celebration came with one undeniable consequence: the hangover. Even in a world where beer was breakfast and lotus wine was medicine, no one escaped the wrath of the morning sun. Ancient medical texts mention pains of the head and recommend honey, herbs, or lying perfect still while pretending to commune with the gods. When that failed, there was the traditional cure. A priest, a bucket of cold Nile water, and a lecture on moderation, which no one ever remembered. But here's the clever part. If you danced shirtless in the temple or passed out beside a statue, you didn't say, "I overdid it." You said, "I was touched by the divine." Not a blackout, a blessing. And everyone nodded respectfully. For those truly suffering, the Egyptians had purging potions, drinks designed to cleanse the body from both ends. Imagine sipping something that tastes like regret while being told it restores your spiritual balance. Meanwhile, the priests had it easier. They had assistance, authority, and experience. The commoners, however, just woke up covered in lotus petals, unsure whether they danced with a god or just someone very enthusiastic about pretending to be one. Still, no one skipped the next festival, because when your religion promises divine enlighten, meant in a good party, how could you resist? Ebrakernity with snacksy. Even in death, the Egyptians planned to keep the fun going. Tombs weren't somber chambers, they were fully furnished starter homes for eternity. Inside, archaeologists have found everything from blue lotus petals and jugs of wine to incense, oils, and the occasional suspiciously sealed jar. When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, he didn't just find golden treasure. He found what looked like the world's oldest wellness kit. Why? Because the soul, needed comfort and stimulation in the afterlife. So the dead were buried with their favorite food, perfumes, amulets, and yes, their mind-altering treats. Some tombs even included instructions for the afterlife, reminding the spirit how to prepare and consume these sacred items. After all, divine amnesia could happen to anyone. And then there was the famous opening of the mouth ritual, meant to restore speech, breath, and the ability to enjoy food and drink. Because really, what's eternity worth if you can't toast Osiris properly? The message was clear. For Egyptians, pleasure and piety weren't opposites. If something brought you closer to the divine in life, it belonged in your tomb too. The high priests of high society Egypt gave us pyramids, mummies, and eyeliner that could block out the sun, but it also gave us the world's first state-approved pharmacists. While the pharaoh wore the crown, the temple priests held the real power. They managed the incense, the medicine, and the ingredients for divine visions. Their sacred apothecaries stocked everything from soothing salves to hallucinogenic mixtures. If it tingled, shimmered, or made you speak in riddles for 3 days, it probably came from the temple. Pharaohs might have ruled by divine right, but priests ruled by divine supply. They were the gatekeepers of transcendence, and the only ones who knew how to mix mandrake with wine without killing anyone. Temples weren't just spiritual centers, they were economic engines. They owned land, employed workers, and cultivated the plants that kept the gods and everyone else feeling blessed. In short, whoever controlled the incense burners controlled the kingdom's spiritual mood. The hierarchy of the high Ebracher. Of course, not everyone had access to the good stuff. Egypt's hierarchy applied to everything, even intoxication. The pharaohs and nobles enjoyed rare blends of lotus wine, opium infusions, and imported cannabis resin. Commoners? They got thick barley beer and a faint whiff of temple smoke if they stood close enough. For the ruling elite, these sacred mixtures weren't indulgence, they were divine duty. A pharaoh who communed with the gods in his dreams wasn't lazy, he was managing national policy through visions. Even in their tombs, the upper class kept their medicine close, jars of incense, vials of oils, and wines labeled with vague instructions like, "for ceremonial use only." Meanwhile, the laborers who dared to dabble without permission risked being branded heretics, or worse. But despite the inequality, everyone, from priest to peasant, shared one belief, that through ritual, rhythm, and maybe a sip of something special, you could brush against the divine. And perhaps that's the real secret of ancient Egypt, a civilization built on the balance between order and ecstasy, geometry and chaos, life and afterlife, all held together by the sweet, hypnotic scent of the blue lotus. After 14 chapters of sacred snorting, divine day drinking, and what can only be described as hallucinogenic healthcare, it's fair to ask, what does all this really tell us about ancient Egypt? For one, it shows that the Egyptians were masters of mixing science, spirituality, and recreation. Of a drum, and the scent of something smoldering that definitely wouldn't pass modern safety standards. They didn't treat altered states as escapism. These trances, dreams, and sacred highs were gateways, ways to access divine insight, healing, and occasionally a very dramatic god with an animal head and a flair for theater. Their ceremonies weren't just rituals, they were chemical performances, incense, chanting, psychotropic brews, and tightly controlled access to the sacred stuff. Think of it as the original exclusive wellness retreat, complete with gatekeeping. The elite had their Blue Lotus spas and imported opium. Everyone else got warm beer and an eye infection. Enlightenment was available, but only if you could afford the deluxe afterlife package, complete with optional spiritual minibar. Brew, but beyond the incense and ecstasy, there's a deeper truth here. Humans have always wanted to feel more, see more, and understand more, preferably while lying down in a temple and avoiding chores. The ancient Egyptians weren't so different from modern humans with their meditation apps and essential oils. They just took their hallucinations a bit more seriously and wore better eyeliner. So maybe our ancestors weren't naive mystics or ancient drug enthusiasts. Maybe they were just people, trying to make sense of a confusing, beautiful, and often painful world, using whatever tools, rituals, and fragrant smoke they had. And if that path to peace involved a little wine, a few flowers, and the occasional trance where you barked like Anubis, well, so be it. From temples to toxins, the Renaissance obsession Abrica fast forward to Florence, late 1400s. The air hums with incense, sweat, and the scent of crushed roses. The city pulses with art, intellect, and ambition. And underneath it all, a quiet kind of madness, an obsession with beauty. And not just any beauty, Renaissance beauty. The kind that meant looking like a porcelain statue, even if it slowly killed you. Ente. Arsarusa. A luxurious white face paint made from, yes, actual lid. Women across Florence and Venice smeared the shimmering poison over their cheeks, foreheads, and chests to achieve that pale, divine glow. In a world where tanned skin meant manual labor, looking like a walking marble sculpture was the ultimate status symbol. But this wasn't a light dusting. Oh no, it was layers, applied thick, polished, and sometimes even slept in so it could soak into the skin overnight. The result? A radiant, ghostly complexion, right up until the sores appeared. When that happened, women simply covered them with more lead, the Renaissance version of a Band-Aid that guaranteed the wound would never heal. And if the lead didn't finish the job, mercury might. It was used to treat blemishes and fade sunspots. Combine that with arsenic tonics and vinegar skin baths, and you've got a full-scale chemical warfare routine marketed as elegance. Though class played its role too. Noble women wanted their SK. In Untouched by Sun or Sweat, a visual proclamation of privilege. The paler you were, the purer and wealthier you appeared, even if it made you dizzy, delirious, or, eventually, dead. Ironically, the very women poisoning themselves with lead and mercury were also dousing their skin with rosewater, sandalwood oils, and perfumes imported from the East. They literally smelled like angels while their faces peeled away. Eyebrows, hairlines, and the pursuit of perfection. If you had eyebrows in Renaissance Florence, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. In the quest to look like the women in Botticelli's paintings, all serene foreheads and smooth brows, ladies plucked their hairlines and eyebrows into oblivion. The higher the forehead, the more noble and intelligent you were considered. This wasn't a one-time beauty ritual, it was weekly maintenance, a painful tradition of tweezers, rough cloth, and, occasionally, seashells. For stubborn regrowth, women applied walnut oil or, incredibly, cat dung mixtures to slow the hair down. Some even singed stray hairs with candle flames, because nothing says refinement like setting your face on fire. The end result? Barely visible brows, sometimes replaced by soft shadows drawn with burnt cork or powdered charcoal, which, unsurprisingly, melted off in the Florentine heat. Imagine your eyebrows slowly sliding down your cheeks during Mass. Divine indeed. Pharaoh body hair, too, was seen as uncivilized. Women removed it with a paste made from vinegar, quicklime, and arsenic, a blend that burned like justice and beauty combined. Meanwhile, hair on the head was tightly braided and arranged with added padding made of wool, horsehair, or even other people's hair. Matching the fashionable golden hue of the season sometimes required bleaching with lye. If it didn't match perfectly, a cap would hide the crime. Renaissance problem-solving at its finest. And remember, mirrors were rare, so all this grooming was done mostly by touch, with servants guiding the process. One wrong move and your noble forehead turned into a tragic haircut. Corsets, class, and the art of suffocation abrige. Once the face was powdered, the brows erased, and the hairline elevated to the heavens, it was time to reshape the body itself. Enter the Renaissance corset, equal parts fashion statement and orthopedic device. Unlike the extreme hourglass corsets of later centuries, Renaissance stays were meant to flatten the torso and elongate the silhouette, giving the wearer a statuesque form. Whalebone and stiff reeds were sewn into linen, laced tight across the back, and fastened with help from an unlucky servant. The result? A rigid, upright posture that signaled virtue and discipline. Slouching suggested moral weakness, or worse, demonic influence. So noble women walked tall, breathed shallowly, and occasionally fainted gracefully in public. That wasn't a problem. It was proof of refinement. Hebrew getting dressed meant layering fabrics in the S. Heat, sweating profusely, and pretending to enjoy it. Comfort wasn't fashionable. Endurance was. Still, corsets had one practical advantage. They held everything in place. Unlike modern bras that revolt by midday, Renaissance stays were architectural marvels. You could faint, dance, or survive a political scandal without anything moving out of place. Working-class women, of course, skipped all this, wearing simpler bodices made for breathing and actual work. But among the elite, a woman without a corset was simply unfinished. The dinner table dilemma obricur, and then came dinner, where fashion and appetite went to war. Renaissance banquets were lavish, roasted peacocks, marzipan sculptures, fruits dipped in gold. But while men feasted freely, noble women had to perform grace under compression. Hebrew, you could nibble, you could sip, but heaven forbid you unhinge your jaw for a proper bite. The corset demanded elegance and punished gluttony, hours of sitting upright while pretending to enjoy cold eel pie could trigger fainting spells, which, conveniently, only enhanced the aesthetic. Pale, breathless, and collapsing into the arms of a handsome nobleman? Perfectly on brand. In private, though, many women broke the illusion. After removing their corsets, they raided secret stashes of sweets and cheese, the original midnight snackers of history. And even that had rules. Cucumbers were banned for watering the complexion. Wine was encouraged for the blush it gave. Some even drank vinegar to stay slim, because nothing says sophistication like eroding your stomach lining. The scent of status Eberg, once the face was painted, the hair plucked, the corset tied, and the meal survived, one final layer remained, the scent of wealth. In Renaissance Florence, perfume wasn't just hygiene, it was hierarchy. A noble woman's fragrance announced her presence before she even entered the room. The poor smelled like work, garlic, goats, and sweat. The rich, they drifted through hall, wrapped in the perfume of rosewater, ambergris, musk, and imported spices. If you didn't leave people slightly intoxicated when you walked by, you weren't doing it right. Venice became the perfume capital of Europe, importing frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, cinnamon from Ceylon, and ambergris, a bizarrely precious substance found in the bellies of sperm whales. Yes, people literally dabbed themselves in luxury whale wax. Perfume wasn't limited to wrists and necks. It soaked into gloves, gowns, and the handkerchiefs women waved dramatically whenever someone with questionable hygiene walked by, which, in Renaissance Italy, was often. Because no matter how many layers of lead, lace, and lye a woman endured, one truth remained: in the Renaissance, beauty was suffering made fashionable, and scented with roses to hide the pain. Perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was armor. For the ambitious woman of the Renaissance, scent wasn't an accessory, it was a strategy. Abricli, the ritu. Al began with a perfumed bath. Rose water if you were romantic, camphor if you were practical. Then came a delicate dusting of crushed violets, followed by oil rubbed into the temples and wrists, and finally a mist of whatever secret potion your apothecary promised would make suitors swoon and enemies faint. Some women wore pomanders, tiny, ornate spheres filled with herbs and spices, around their necks or dangling from their belts. These weren't just for fragrance, they were statements. Each one said, "Approach carefully. I smell of cinnamon and judgment." But not all perfumes were harmless. Many were concoctions of turpentine, lead, or other ingredients strong enough to trigger headaches or even fainting. One wrong recipe, and your aura of seduction turned into a migraine in a bottle. Still, the right scent could open doors, disarm rivals, and, in the unwashed chaos of a Renaissance crowd, help you simply survive. Ebru, because in that world, beauty was battle, and Florence was its glittering war zone. Ebrii, the war of fabric and fashion. Ebriki. If the Renaissance was a battlefield, then fashion was the armor. Your gown wasn't just something you wore, it was your declaration, your family's wealth, your husband's status, and your personal audacity stitched into every thread. Velvet ruled the court, thick, heavy, and imported at prices that could make a merchant weep. Wearing it in summer wasn't foolish, it was power. You might be melting, but you were important. Then came brocade, the fabric that said color isn't enough, woven with gold thread into scenes of vines, lions, or entire biblical stories. Brocade turned dresses into wearable altarpieces. The more complex the pattern, the louder the prestige. Ebrhi and sleeves, sleeves were the designer handbags of their time. Detachable, mix and match, embroidered, pearl-encrusted, sometimes so grand they required their own servant. Wealthy women collected them like trophies, flaunting new sets at every event. Ebru colors carry their own secret language. Deep blues and crimsons required rare pigments, lapis lazuli and cochineal, dyes so precious they were stored like treasure. Laws tried to limit these hues to nobility, but fashion always found a way to break the rules. Even the underlayers were lavish, lace-trimmed chemises, silk petticoats, jeweled girdles with hidden compartments for perfume, prayer books, or love letters. But the price of beauty was steep. A single gown could cost more than a craftsman's annual wage. Yet for noble women, wearing the same dress twice? Social suicide. The fetish of footwear Ebrurker below all that luxury hid one of the strangest obsessions of the era, shoes. Women's feet were rarely seen, yet footwear became a secret weapon of status. Enter the Chopin, the Renaissance's answer to high heels, born in Venice. These sky-high platforms began as practical protection from filthy streets but soon became fashion statements. Some stood over 20 inches tall, turning every step into an acrobatic act of defiance. Walking unaided was nearly impossible, so servants often flanked their mistresses like living crutches. A fall wasn't just embarrassing, it could take out half the wedding party. Ebru, in Florence, styles were tamer but no less refined. Velvet slippers embroidered with silk thread and lined with fur were worn indoors, while wooden platforms called pattens were strapped beneath to protect them outdoors. Practical, yes, unless you tripped on cobblestones and shattered both pride and kneecaps. The ideal foot was delicate and narrow, and shoes were designed more for gliding than walking. After all, true ladies didn't walk, they floated. Abric silk stockings tied with scented ribbons completed the look. If someone happened to glimpse your ankle, a scandalous act in itself, at least you'd smell divine. The dance of power Aberhair, after hours of being powdered, laced, perfumed, and polished, the evening crescendoed with the ultimate social performance, dancing. Aberhuranesa. NCE court dances weren't carefree jigs. They were choreographed theater. Every step, every bow, every glance was a coded message of grace, rank, and restraint. A wrong step wasn't just awkward, it was social disaster. Misplace your foot, and you might as well have shouted, "I own nothing dyed in lapis lazuli." The popular dances, the pavane and the galliard, demanded poise under pressure. Corsets crushed your ribs, your gown weighed 20 pounds, and still you had to glide like a breeze. Breathing through your mouth, unthinkable. Passing out, common. Ibri, but the dance floor wasn't just about elegance, it was strategy. Each turn offered fleeting proximity to an eligible suitor. A gloved touch, a lingering glance, a brush of perfume, flirtation with a footnote. One misstep, however, and your entire image could crumble. All around, whispers hummed, other women judging your sleeves, your posture, your poise. You smiled through the pain, bowed with precision, and when the music ended, lipped away to repowder before round 2. The night unmasked Ebrich at last. The candles burned low, the guests were gone, and the Renaissance beauty, dazzling, divine, and absolutely exhausted, returned to her chambers. Bruf, but rest? Not yet. The nightly ritual awaited. First came the cleansing. Rosewater, linen cloths, and egg whites to lift away layers of toxic lead-based makeup. Scrub too hard, and you'd lose skin along with the paint. Eberch, next, the hair. Pins removed, false braids unwound, adhesive dissolved, hopefully without revealing bald patches from last week's lime and cat dung depilatory treatment. Bibri, then came the corset unlacing, a sacred moment of release marked by gasps and groans as ribs re-expanded. Slippers came off to reveal toes crushed by fashion's cruelty. If lucky, you soaked your feet in lavender water. If not, you simply stared at them in despair. Finally, your maid massaged you with sweet oils or dubious elixirs claiming eternal youth, mixtures that smelled lick. Rust and regret. Brigger then, a delicate puff to extinguish the candle. You lay down, paler, thinner, breathless, but ready to do it all again tomorrow. Because in Renaissance Florence, beauty wasn't a choice. It was a full-time performance, and the audience was everyone. The inked armor of Japan Ibrekruk, across the world, another kind of adornment told stories not through silk or scent, but through skin. Before tattoos in Japan became linked to crime syndicates, they carried meanings of honor, identity, and devotion. In early Japan, tattoos began as punishment, marks carved into criminals' skin to brand them as outcasts. But by the Edo period, they had transformed into an underground art form of stunning intricacy and spiritual symbolism. In a society ruled by strict class codes, commoners weren't allowed to flaunt luxury clothing or jewelry, so they wore beauty beneath the surface. Ink replaced brocade, skin became canvas. Laborers, firemen, and gamblers adopted full-body tattoos called rezumi, living tapestries of dragons, phoenixes, koi fish, and deities. Each motif had purpose. Koi symbolized perseverance. Dragons signified power. Cherry blossoms reminded wearers of life's fragility. Ibruhri's tattoos weren't printed. They were earned. Artists known as horishi used wooden handles and steel needles to hand-poke ink into flesh, one painful tap at a time. Sessions could last hours. A full suit took years. The result was breathtaking. A secret masterpiece hidden beneath plain clothes, revealed only in baths or festivals. Authorities deemed tattoos indecent, symbols of rebellion and waste. Yet that secrecy only made them more sacred. For those who wore them, tattoos were more than art. They were identity. The firemen of Edo Aburi, nowhere was this truer than among the Hikeishi, Edo's fearless firefighters. In a city built of wood and paper, fires were constant, and these men faced them head-on. They didn't douse flames with water. They tore down burning homes with hooks, ND axes to halt the spread. Every blaze was a battle. Their tattoos became their armor. Dragons for power, tigers for courage, gods and demons for protection. When they stripped down to fight a fire, their bodies glowed with inked mythology. Proof of bravery, brotherhood, and defiance. The pain of tattooing wasn't just tolerated, it was embraced. Enduring thousands of needle strikes prepared them for facing infernos. Their bodies told their stories long before they spoke. In Edo, Japan, flames consumed wood. But through ink, men carved immortality into their own skin. They weren't just marks on the skin, they were proof of fearlessness, loyalty, and pain endured not for vanity, but for brotherhood. Among the fire brigades of Edo period Japan, tattoos became silent badges of honor. Each stroke of ink told the story of courage and camaraderie, a declaration that said, "I belong to this crew and I'll burn with them if I have to." Entire teams often shared the same motifs. Dragons coiling across their backs, waves curling down their arms, blossoms blooming in unison, all symbolizing unity in the face of chaos. It wasn't gang symbolism, it was solidarity, a brotherhood forged in smoke, sweat, and fire. But make no mistake, it wasn't exactly approved. Tattoos were still officially condemned, dismissed by the authorities as vulgar or wasteful, an unseemly indulgence for men who were supposed to serve the public. So, the Hikeshi, Edo's fearless firemen, wore their ink in secret, hidden beneath layers of uniform. Only in bathhouses or during raucous festivals would they bare their full suits, earning admiration from their neighborhoods, even as the ruling elite whispered in disapproval. Ironically, these men were both celebrated and feared. To the upper class, their tattoos were a sign of danger. To everyone else, they were symbols of devotion, living art wrapped around living heroes. Beyond the fire brigades and the laborers, another group carried the torch of Irezumi, the gamblers, drifters, and thrill-seekers of Edo's underground. They were known as the Bakuto, professional gamblers who roamed the floating world of Ukiyo, a realm of fleeting pleasures, neon lanterns, and endless nights. These men didn't live by society's rules. They lived by the throw of a dice. And on their skin, they wore their rebellion. Tattoos were their declaration of independence, vivid, unapologetic, and full of meaning. Peonies, serpents, gods of fortune, and ferocious warriors danced across their bodies. Each tattoo shouted a message: "I don't follow your laws, I make my own." The imagery often drew from folklore and kabuki theater, legendary heroes who defied power, outsmarted corrupt rulers, and lived fast under impossible odds. For men like the Bakuto, tattoos weren't mere decoration. They were armor for the spirit, symbols of survival in a society that had cast them aside. And while polite society tried to erase their existence, their legend grew in the flickering light of sake bars and gambling dens. Tattoo culture in Edo, Japan is often seen as a man's world, all brawny firemen and fearless gamblers. But beneath the layers of silk and secrecy, women too carved their own quiet rebellions into their skin. These were not the grand mythological scenes that covered a man's back. Women's tattoos were intimate, emotional, and often heartbreakingly personal. A lover's name etched near the collarbone, a phrase inked under the sleeve, hidden from all but one pair of eyes. It was called Irezumi Chobun. The love tattoo, the most popular inscription read, "Inochi azukemasu, I entrust you with my life." More than a romantic gesture, it was a vow written in pain. Lovers marked each other this way, binding themselves through ink long before the law ever could. In Edo's pleasure districts, courtesans and geisha turned tattoos into a subtle art of seduction. A delicate glimpse of ink revealed beneath a slipping robe became an invitation, an illusion of intimacy. To each client, the tattoo seemed like a secret, even though it might have been shared with many. But these tattoos could also turn into scars of betrayal. When a lover abandoned her, a courtesan might burn or cut through his name, or cover it with new art. Dragons swallowing the letters, waves washing away the memory. Each scar told a story of passion, heartbreak, and defiance. Even ordinary women, peasants, fisherwomen, wives of tattooed men, sometimes followed suit, quietly marking themselves with small hidden tattoos. They risked social disgrace, but the ink gave them something rare: agency. In a world that demanded obedience, they claimed a piece of themselves in secret. Behind every dragon, every koi, and every whispered love mark, there stood the horishi, the tattoo masters of Edo. They worked in the shadows. Tiny rooms above tea houses, back corners of barbershops, candlelit studios that smelled of incense and ink. No signs, no advertisements. Only whispers of reputation. To be tattooed by a great horishi was an honor, to endure his process, a trial. Becoming one took years of apprenticeship. The tools were simple: wooden handles tipped with steel needles, dipped in a thick black ink called sumi, made from soot and glue. Each line was hand-tapped into the flesh using a method called tabori, a rhythm of patience, pain, and precision. The result wasn't just art, it was endurance made visible. Hebrew, but Horishi were more than craftsmen. They were storytellers, philosophers, psychologists. Each tattoo carried layers of meaning. A cherry blossom fading into waves for the impermanence of life. A tiger climbing a mountain for bravery against fate. The client might bring the idea, but it was the master who decided how the story should live on the skin. Sometimes Horishi even signed their work, hidden within the folds of a dragon's tail or a lotus petal, a tiny secret known only to those in the know. They lived, on society's edge, respected in the underworld, ignored by the elite. Yet their art turned pain into permanence. Ibrahim, and that pain, it wasn't a side effect. It was the point. Tabori, the ancient hand-poked technique, demanded stillness, discipline, and raw endurance. Each session could last hours. A full bodysuit could take years. There were no numbing creams, no shortcuts, only the rhythmic tapping of needles and the client's quiet resolve. In Edo, Japan, to endure the pain of tattooing was to prove your spirit. Firefighters saw it as courage training. Gamblers called it a test of loyalty. Lovers took it as proof of devotion. Pain wasn't punishment, it was purification. Each drop of ink became a meditation on patience, control, and transformation. The more pain you endured, the more meaning your tattoo carried. Only the most dedicated completed the munuwari, the full-body suit that covered shoulders to thighs, leaving a small blank panel on the chest to preserve modesty if the obi slipped open. Ebru. In a society where nobles wore silk and power, the tattooed wore agony and immortality. Every line of ink told a story. A koi swimming upstream, persistence against all odds. Dragons, protectors of wisdom and nature, coiling like guardians over the spine. Tigers for strength, waves for fate's unpredictability. Demons as reminders of inner battles. Many tattoos told epic stories. Battles, betrayals, acts of divine vengeance, often inspired by Suikoden, the Chinese tale of 108 outlaw heroes. These outcasts mirrored the tattooed classes of Edo, rebels, protectors, men and women who lived by their own moral codes when society left them none. Ibra, even Buddhist figures made their way into the art. The fierce Fudo Myo-o, sword in one hand and rope in the other, symbolized protection and truth. Having him etched on your back meant carrying a spiritual guardian, one unafraid to fight on your behalf. Habriki placement mattered. A tiger climbing upward symbolized ambition. A dragon, coiling downward, warned of restraint. Every decision, every needle stroke became part of a personal mythology written in flesh. But as the Edo period drew on, admiration turned to suspicion. What began as a quiet language of honor and beauty became associated with rebellion and crime. As gamblers and outlaws adopted tattoos more visibly, the ruling class began to panic. To them, these designs no longer symbolized loyalty or bravery. They symbolized defiance. And so, as crime syndicates evolved into the early Yakuza, tattoos transformed from emblems of pride to marks of fear. The irony was tragic. What began as art, courage, and identity became branded as criminality. The same dragons that once protected became targets of prejudice. The government could outlaw tattooing, but it couldn't erase what it meant. Beneath the ink lived stories of firemen, lovers, gamblers, and artists, all bound by pain, beauty, and a shared defiance of conformity. Ibrakri, because in the end, Irizumi was ne. They're just decoration. It was a heartbeat under the skin. The story of Japan's forgotten souls, written in pain, sealed in ink, and remembered forever. When the government wanted control, they didn't just issue warnings, they banned. By the early 1800s, tattooing in Japan wasn't just frowned upon, it was officially outlawed. But laws are one thing, enforcement another. Depending on who was watching, tattoos either vanished or went deeper underground. Hidden studios flourished in whispers. Horishi, Japan's master tattoo artists, began working in secret. Clients booked appointments through coded language, and new techniques emerged to hide designs beneath layers of ink or blend them into complex patterns that fooled inspectors. But the stigma wasn't just legal, it was social. Anyone with visible tattoos could be barred from public baths, denied entry into temples, or rejected in marriage by respectable families. What was once a symbol of courage and devotion had now been rebranded as indecent, dangerous, even evil. Yet, tattoos never truly died. They simply went beneath the skin and beneath the radar. Every crackdown only pushed the art deeper into mystery. Each new law sparked new designs, new secret clients, new reasons to endure pain for something meaningful. Irizumi didn't disappear. It waited, coiled like a dragon in the dark. Then came 1868 and the Meiji Restoration. Japan was modernizing fast and desperate to impress the West. The new government wanted a country that looked civilized, disciplined, and above all, Western. And in this polished image of modern Japan, tattoos had no place. Irizumi, rich in culture and craftsmanship, was declared a national embarrassment. Tattooing became not just illegal, but shameful. Foreign diplomats were scandalized by the sight of Japan's working-class men proudly covered in intricate bodysuits. So, to seem more refined, Japan buried its own art form even deeper. But here's the twist. While Japan's citizens were punished for their tattoos, foreign sailors were fascinated by them. British and American mariners docked at Japanese ports, seeking out horishi to take home what they saw as exotic body art. Ironically, the very culture Japan tried to erase was being preserved by outsiders who idolized it. The horishi adapted. They changed clientele, moved deeper into secrecy, and protected the tabori method, the hand-poked tattoo technique, through quiet, unbroken lineages. Skills, symbols, and stories were whispered from master to apprentice, often within families like sacred heirlooms. By the 20th century, Irizumi found itself tied to something darker, the yakuza. The full-body tattoo, once a badge of honor and artistry, became a mark of criminal loyalty. Hidden beneath suits, these tattoos represented pain, endurance, and silence. The art remained breathtaking, but its reputation tainted. Even today, that shadow lingers. Public baths, gyms, and beaches still turn away Opal with tattoos. The fear of criminal ink still shapes perception. Yet the tide is changing. A new generation of Japanese artists is reclaiming Irizumi, not as rebellion, but as heritage. Museums now preserve ancient designs once shunned as indecent. Historians celebrate the craftsmanship, and more voices are asking the question Japan has avoided for centuries. Why be ashamed of the skin that tells your story? Because in a culture layered with robes, rituals, and silence, tattoos remain one of Japan's most honest forms of expression. Transition from ink to ink on paper, But Japan wasn't the only place hiding its passions beneath the surface. Across the ocean in Renaissance Europe, another kind of ink was causing scandal, not on skin, but paper. Talking about sex openly was forbidden, unless it was done in Latin and printed under church supervision. Enter the marriage manual, the most sanctified form of smut ever written. These weren't steamy novels, they were theological how-to guides for married couples. Titles like De Matrimonio or The Book of the Family disguised what they really were: explicit rule books on when, how, and why good Christians could be intimate. And the rules? Endless. Sex. On Sundays? Sinful. On feast days? Absolutely not. Brucka during Lent? God forbid. Add them up, and nearly half the year was off limits. Combine that with guilt and nosy priests, and it's a miracle Europe ever reproduced. The manuals also dictated the correct mindset during the act. Joy was suspicious, passion dangerous, love fine, as long as it wasn't too exciting. Women were to be silent and obedient. Men were told not to enjoy themselves too much. The goal was spiritual unity, with just enough physical effort to make a baby. Yet despite the dull prose, these books were bestsellers, especially among the clergy. Readers studied them for moral instruction, though the dog-eared pages told another story. And when people got bored of Holy Manu, ALS, they turned to something new, science. Transition from theology to anatomy. The Renaissance saw a boom in anatomy books. They were supposed to be about medicine, but let's be honest, they were also the perfect loophole for forbidden desire. Texts like De Humani Corporis Fabrica by Andreas Vesalius were groundbreaking studies of the human body, but they also featured highly detailed, beautifully illustrated nude figures, often female, often idealized. One infamous edition showed a naked woman reclining gracefully, like a Botticelli painting, except her chest was cut open in anatomical detail. Horrifying and sensual all at once, the body as science, the body as art, the body as temptation. Since these images were educational, they slipped right past church censorship. A student caught with one could always claim he was studying anatomy. The fact that the page was worn from overuse was just a coincidence. Printers caught on. Some editions leaned into the erotic, icism, blending art and anatomy into Renaissance softcore. If you wanted to look at naked people, all you had to do was pretend to care about the spleen. Transition. From bodies to hearts, but not every forbidden book hid behind science. Hebrew. Some were bolder. Love manuals, half etiquette guide, half flirtation playbook. They taught nobles how to woo gracefully, flatter subtly, and flirt without damning their souls. One might explain the proper hand placement during a slow court dance. Another offered sample dialogues for complimenting a duchess or apologizing to her chaperone. Renaissance readers adored double meanings. Every poem, every riddle, every sigh behind a fan was a coded gesture. These manuals weren't about lust, they were about the delicious tension just before it. And tucked beside them, under candlelight, were the truly forbidden texts, ancient Roman and Greek works that made church officials furious. Transition, the forbidden shelf, Ovid's Ars Amatoria, he Art of Love, was practically the Renaissance version of a dating app tutorial. It detailed everything from spotting your crush at the theater to pretending jealousy just enough to keep things spicy. The church called it heresy. Readers called it brilliant. Hidden behind Bibles or rebound under fake titles, these books circulated quietly. Marginal notes in surviving copies even say things like, "Try this at Carnival" or "Worked on Cecilia." So much for pious reading. Meanwhile, the Inquisition began cracking down. In 1559, Pope Paul IV published the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the official list of forbidden books. Hebrew Ovid, banned. Ebroxiprocatio, banned. Erasmus, double banned. The church wasn't just protecting faith, it was policing imagination, but banning only made the books more desirable. Printers in Venice, Lyon, and Basel sold censored public editions and secret, uncut ones for select clients. One copy of The Golden Ass was rebound as Sermons of St. Augustine. Talk about div. Ein irony. Enber fee. Transition. The secret libraries of women, and while men faced the Inquisition, women, especially nuns, found subtler ways to rebel. Behind convent walls, they had access to books, ink, and privacy. Some convent libraries were respectable on the surface, filled with prayer books and theological commentaries. But between those pages, hidden poems, translations of Ovid, even anatomical drawings for education. Many nuns didn't choose the veil. They were placed there by families. Intelligent, emotional, and confined, they found freedom in words. Some wrote love poetry under pseudonyms, others secretly translated erotic verse. These weren't acts of sin, they were acts of survival, of imagination, because sometimes the most forbidden stories weren't about desire, Freeber. They were about freedom, transition from love to magic Ibrahi. But not every secret book stayed in a library. Some were hidden under floorboards, wrapped in cloth, or whispered from memory, books of spells, charms, and potions. Ibri. The Renaissance was obsessed with magic, and love spells were the most dangerous of all. Recipes mixed science with superstition, a lock of hair, a sip of wine, a whispered name under the moon. Aphrodisiacs blended cinnamon, oysters, and herbs, sometimes romantic, sometimes toxic. One manual recommended powdered stag antler to ignite passion. It also caused nosebleeds, but passion is pain, right? Women were the primary keepers of these texts, midwives, herbalists, mothers. Knowledge was power, and power in a woman's hands terrified the church. A love spell could earn you a lover, or a trial for witchcraft. So they hid their pages, burned them, or disguised them as herb journals. Final transition, the birth of the printed desire Ebrabri. Then came the printing press, and desire went mass market. Venice became the capital of forbidden literature. Hidden behind scholarly commentaries and religious texts, small private books began to appear. Books that didn't attend to be holy or scientific. They were bold, illustrated, and scandalously direct. Abri, the most notorious, Imodi, the positions, Abri, created by engraver Marcantonio Raimondi with verses by Pietro Aretino. Imodi featured 16 vividly erotic scenes paired with poetic commentary. It was witty, shocking, and way ahead of its time, so much so that the church immediately banned it, seized the plates, and imprisoned Raimondi. Sibri, but the idea was unstoppable. The printing press had given birth to something new, the world's first mass-produced erotica, and, from that moment on, human desire was no longer confined to whisperers, parchment, or coded metaphors. Hebrews, it had found ink, and ink, as history shows us, never truly fades. As censorship tightened its grip, the presses didn't stop. They simply went underground. Across Europe, secret print shops began producing slim, elegant volumes filled with love poetry, scandalous stories, and, occasionally, pure, unfiltered smut. Abris weren't mass mark. Tea books, they were treasures, handcrafted for wealthy patrons who could afford to indulge in the forbidden. Some were even commissioned privately, custom fantasies printed on fine parchment. Think of it as the Renaissance version of fanfiction, except written in Latin and bound in velvet. Printers became masters of disguise. Aberkey fake title pages, false publication cities like Constantinople or Alexandria, Latin phrases that made the content sound like moral philosophy or natural science. But open the pages and you'd find something else entirely, intricate woodcuts and copper engravings that made anatomy textbooks look innocent. For the right price, you could own a book that thrilled, amused, or outright shocked, all without ever admitting you had it. Many nobles kept theirs locked away in private cabinets, their spines disguised as dictionaries or hymnals. Some even had secret bindings designed to hide the real pages inside. A. Brewer, the printing press hadn't just democratized knowledge, it had made desire portable. Ibrahim, and with every new, forbidden volume, the Renaissance took one step closer to something revolutionary, pleasure without permission. By the end of the Renaissance, the line between education, entertainment, and seduction had completely blurred. What began as theology or anatomy had evolved into a hidden library of longing, one that crossed gender, class, and even religion. Ibrahim to the church, these books were proof of moral decay. To scholars, they were bold experiments in thought. But to the people who actually read them, the noblewomen, the students, the nuns, the merchants, they were something else entirely. They were power, not the loud political kind, but the quiet, subversive kind that begins in the margins of a page. In an era when women's voices were silenced, their bodies controlled, and their desires suppressed, these books offered an alternative script, one where love wasn't arranged, where pleasure could be spoken, and where curiosity did. Nate need to hide behind Latin. Here. Whether it was a love spell tucked inside a herb manual, a censored poem copied by hand, or a band's sonnet read by candlelight, each page was a small act of rebellion. And let's be honest, the men weren't innocent either. For all their sermons and scholarly debates, philosophers and priests were buying these books too. A theologian might preach about virtue by day and secretly read the Golden Ass by night, glass of wine in hand. A priest might thunder against temptation from the pulpit, with a copy of Ovid's Art of Love hidden under his cassock. Because if history proves anything, it's that human nature has always been excellent at compartmentalizing. The forbidden bookshelf wasn't just a quirk of the Renaissance. It was a mirror, a reflection of a world wrestling with change. Pre the printing press had cracked open Pandora's box. Keyboard literacy was spreading. Ideas were multiplying. And once people discovered that books could make them feel deeply, privately, even sinfully, there was no turning back. Most of these books didn't survive. They were burned, hidden, or quietly miscatalogued. But a few did. And today, they rest in museum vaults and rare book rooms, fragile, yellowed, and humming with centuries-old secrets. Because the Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of art and science. It was a rebirth of desire. And in between the marble statues and church sermons, these forbidden pages whisper the one truth the sculptures never could: that the human spirit has always found a way to write what it cannot say.